This is the Truckers Network radio show on tncradio.live, where we offer news, information, traffic, weather, sports, and entertainment our commercial drivers need and want. I'm your host, Shelley Johnson. Many of our drivers have difficulty sleeping or even struggle with depression or memory issues. There can be a lot of different things. Mental health is something we like to cover for our audience, so we consult with various experts from time to time. Dr. Rebecca M. Allen is the Director of Neuropsychiatry at the Seattle Neuropsychiatric Treatment Center. She authored a chapter on sleep and sleep disorders for the Harvard textbook Neuropsychiatry and Behavioral Neurology, Principles and Practice. Dr. Allen is trained in the neurobiological basis and treatment of cognitive and behavioral changes due to neurodegenerative diseases like dementia, stroke, traumatic brain injury, multiple sclerosis, and other conditions. We have Dr. Allen with us today to talk about her research and what we can learn from what occurs in the brain. Welcome, Dr. Allen. Thank you for being with me on the show today.
Thank you, Shelley. Glad to be here.
You know, there's so many things that go on in the brain. Do we really know exactly how the brain works? Have we come any distance in the past few decades?
We've come quite a distance, I would say. I remember the 1990s were nicknamed at the time by popular media the decade of the brain. And that's because certain kinds of neuroimaging or brain imaging were starting to be used more often, specifically the kind of imaging where you can look at where the blood is flowing in the brain and say, okay, well, that part of the brain must be more active than this other part of the brain because we can see where the blood is going. And that's called fMRI or functional MRI. Since then, MRIs scans have gotten a lot better. There's been a lot of work on, looking at brains in animals and looking at different aspects from the cellular level, from the neurons, the brain cells, all the way up to networks in the brain and seeing how parts of the brain connect. I think one of the biggest shifts is thinking about the networks, about different parts of the brain working together, rather than thinking about each part of the brain having a kind of separate function.
Yeah, didn't doctors and scientists kind of think that there were different sections and functions of the brain rather than an integrated circuit?
Well, that's still true. So there are still parts of the brain where if you get that part of the brain damaged,
Mhm.
like if you get a lesion from a stroke or from an injury, that you can see very specific things happening in terms of changes. Like there are parts of the brain in most people on the left side where if that particular part of the brain gets damaged, then you get certain kinds of language issues that are where you can pretty much predict what the
Mhm.
language issue is going to be. But that's the exception. Even the language areas are part of a network of language comprehension and production. And then when you get to how we think, the higher consciousness, think in terms of emotional processing, it becomes much more complicated and much less sort of like this part does this and that part does that, but these parts working together and how strong the connections are between different parts of the brain has a lot to do with emotional health. In depression, we know that certain parts of the brain being more or less connected with each other can be signs of depression that we can see on scans, and not in individuals. We're talking about like groups of people with depression being compared to groups of people without depression, and that's when you can see these differences in brains that are depressed versus brains that are not depressed in these networks.
Now, is this an MRI that's showing that?
Yes, a special
Mhm.
kind of MRI with some complicated computer processing. But yes, this connectivity mapping, it's called, looking at how strong these connections are, is really up and coming in brain science. And there is some work right now in looking at people's connectivity on an individual level and trying to decide on certain aspects of what treatments people should get. But that is very far from being widely available or something that is, in clinical use for patients. But it's something that's in the research world, kind of up and coming and pretty exciting.
Interesting. So when they're seeing differences, if somebody's depressed versus someone who is not, what areas of the brain are impacted where they see the changes?
Yeah. Well, I think the most well-known example is the relationship between some of the deeper structures in the brain that are kind of in the frontal areas. If you go behind the forehead and in the middle, and then down a little bit. So areas in the cingulate part of the brain is what it's called, and looking at how those parts of the brain connect with the frontal areas, with the particularly the left and right side frontal areas that you can think about as being just above the temple and sort of at the top of the forehead. So when we are looking at brain stimulation, um, uh, the the targets, where we put the coil, what we do with our stimulation technology, where we put it, um, that has to do with these networks and what parts of these networks are seemingly abnormal in a depressed brain or in a brain with high anxiety, and trying to correct some of those imbalances in the circuit, I think, is the easiest way to think about it.
So, in order to correct those imbalances, is that done chemically with some sort of medication? Are these neurochemicals that are maybe deficient?
Well, yes and no. So last year, there was an article that came out um, that was saying to the world, hey, the serotonin hypothesis of depression is not true. And that surprised absolutely nobody within mental health and research and psychiatry and psychology. But it was something that came as a surprise to the general public, because drug companies for a long time, because people are much more comfortable doing a treatment when they feel they have a really good handle on how the treatment works and what the treatment is supposed to be doing,
Hmm.
even if that handle, even if that explanation is sort of inadequate or incomplete. If there's something where people can articulate, okay, this is how this drug is supposed to work, it's a lot more comfortable to take the drug. So the drug companies knew that, of course, and they put these advertisements on television and in like magazines and all over the place that said this drug or that drug will correct a serotonin imbalance in your brain. And it's not actually true, though, that people with depression have a known serotonin imbalance. So I would say a really good analogy for this is aspirin treats headaches, right? But
Hmm.
aspirin treats headaches by going after the symptoms, not correcting something that actually went wrong to create the headache. So we don't have a lack of aspirin in our brains, and the aspirin is correcting that. We have some pathways of chemicals that are causing headaches, and aspirin changes those pathways to lessen the inflammation and lessen the pain. So our medications for mental health conditions are very similar to that. We're not going after some known underlying pathophysiology for the most part. We're not saying this is the cause and we're going to change the cause. We are using the medications in order to try and change some of these pathways in order to help improve the mood and improve the function of the circuit. So, and medications go after this in a way that, frankly, is more messy and confusing. Brain stimulation, like TMS, it's a little bit more obvious what it's doing and how and where, because it's a treatment that is focused on a specific part of the brain.
Hmm.
Whereas drugs, medications, they go everywhere in the body, they affect everything in the body, and they go everywhere in the blood and do various things. And sometimes it's hard to tell of all the things that they do, which are the things that are working and helping and are important for improving mood or improving mental health, and which of the things they're doing are not important.
Or maybe causing some symptoms or contraindications you don't want in the rest of the body.
Yes, side
Yeah.
effects. I mean, a very good example of this is the serotonin medication. So medications that affect serotonin, like Prozac and Zoloft, and to a certain degree, Effexor and Cymbalta, all of these meds will affect the gut because there's a lot of serotonin activity in the gut.
Mm-hmm.
So you're trying to get at the serotonin pathways in the brain, but you're also getting at the serotonin pathways elsewhere. So you end up with side effects.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And what's really interesting about, I mean, everything interesting about the brain. I mean, I think it's the most interesting part of the body and of who we are. But the brain cells, the neurons, are both chemical and electrical. So actually similar to the cells in the heart. So the brain cells, when they're passing messages between each other, they're sending these little packets of chemicals that kind of drift from one cell to another, and that's how the cells talk to each other. The message that's passed along a cell, though, from one end of the cell to the other, and often neurons are kind of long and skinny,
Mm-hmm.
that is electrical. So you can think of neurons, of brain cells, as a bunch of electrical wires that then when they connect with each other, connect with chemicals. And so you can go after, when you're trying to treat a mental health issue, when you're talking about the biological treatments, putting aside the talk therapy and group therapy, and all of that has its place, but the pure biological treatments and thinking about what is it doing, you're either going after the chemical part of how those cells work, or you're going after the electrical part. And all drugs universally are going after the chemical piece.
Mm-hmm. So they're only getting a portion.
Well, I think it's hard to say. So whether a drug works and why a drug works are frustratingly separate. And that's just because there's a limit in every part of the body, not just the brain, but the brain is particularly complex. There's a limit to how much we really know about the biology, because it is, I mean, at times it seems infinitely complex. So the way things work in science, the way things work in medicine, is we have a guess that something might work, will probably work, we think it's going to work. And then it logically makes sense that it should work. And then we test it. And a lot of the time it doesn't work. And then we're wondering, well, what did we miss? Why is it not working? Even though based upon what we knew before, logically that should happen. So it's very different from like philosophy and law, where if you can make a logical case, if you can think this should be, then it's as good as true. With
Sure.
Science, you think it should be true, and then you test it and it's not, and you're left scratching your head. And that makes it both interesting and I would say frustrating.
Oh,
So we
absolutely.
know, yeah, we know that these drugs work, right? Because we've tested them really well in these clinical trials where the medication is compared against a fake version of the medication, a placebo,
Mm-hmm.
and the medications work better. They don't work in everyone, but they certainly work in a lot of people. But then can we explain exactly why? When you think about all the drugs that didn't make it, to being used, they failed at various points in clinical trials and they should have worked. And then we have some that do work, and that's why you can get them and again get prescribed. It's utterly fascinating, and also not what it seems when you're looking at the final product and hearing from a drug company, well, this is our very simplistic explanation of what this is doing.
Sure. Well, there's so much more to unpack here, Dr. Allen, but we do need to go to commercial break.
Okay.
I'm talking with Dr. Rebecca M. Allen. She's the director of neuropsychiatry at the Seattle Neuropsychiatric Treatment Center. She's just a wealth of information. This is just fascinating. You're listening to the Truckers Network radio show here on tncradio.live. Stay tuned for more coming up. The Truckers Network helps professional drivers save money and makes their lives easier. We were created for drivers by a commercial driver. We know the industry and driver needs. A Truckers Network membership offers exclusive discounts through our trusted partners on things like truck care, truck parking, tires, oil changes, fuel additives, fitness, roadside assistance, first aid kits, driver training, and a whole lot more. Start saving today. Check us out at app.thetruckersnetwork.net. That's app.thetruckersnetwork.net. The trucking industry keeps America running thanks to the 3.36 million professional truck drivers who deliver everyday goods to 80% of American communities who rely on trucking for that last mile. The industry represents a diverse group with nearly half of drivers at 42% as minorities. Trucking Moves America Forward, or TNRS, educates the public on the essentiality of trucking by telling the story of trucking and its positive impact on our economy, communities, and lives. Learn how you can join the industry movement by visiting truckingmovesamerica.com. Welcome back to the Truckers Network radio show on tncradio.live. I'm Shelley Johnson, and I'm speaking with Dr. Rebecca M. Allen. She's the Director of Neuropsychiatry at the Seattle Neuropsychiatric Treatment Center. Sleep is something that our drivers sometimes have a real challenge getting, and they can get sleep disorders. Dr. Allen, what happens in the brain when we sleep? It really is a curiosity.
Oh, it is such a curiosity. It's utterly fascinating, and I think we don't think about it enough because it's easy to forget about sleep when you're awake. It's something that happens, but you don't really remember it. We don't form memories of the 6 or 8 hours that we're asleep. But we spend a third of our lives sleeping, so it must be important in some way. There must be reasons biologically why that has to happen. And if you look across the animal kingdom, though, there's all kinds of examples of different ways that animals do and don't have rest periods and do and don't have sleep. My favorite example is in mammals who live in the water, like dolphins. They tend to have no, they don't tend to. They do have one part of their brain sleeping at a time. So one hemisphere sleeps and the other does not. Uh, so they are only what we would consider to be half asleep, which is very interesting. And birds who migrate have very different sleeping patterns during the times of migration versus the times when they're not migrating. So there's a lot of variability. So you got to ask yourself, well, why is sleep the way it is in people? What is so special about what our brain and body does during this time that we have to be like down and with our eyes shut and essentially helpless for 8 hours out
Mhm.
of the day? And there are a lot of theories for this, but what we do know about what happens during sleep is that it's very much divided up into different stages, and the stages occur in a certain order. So, not all sleep is the same. When you fall asleep, you go through stage 0, stage 1, and then you go, usually in pictures, it's portrayed as going down, but you go down into the deep sleep, the stage 3, 4 sleep. And then you come back up to the lighter stages, and then you have what's called a rapid eye movement period, a REM period. And that's when you have the complicated kind of story dreams. You can have dreams in other parts of sleep that tend to be little more simplistic snippets, but the complex story dreams, the ones that we think of as dreaming, happen during REM. And then you have the cycle again, where you're going down into these deeper stages and then you're coming back up and you have another REM. Usually people have about 4 cycles a night, and the shape of that curve, you know, how long you spend and how deep you go in these sort of deeper stages becomes shallower in the last 2 cycles of the night, and you're spending less time in deep sleep and more time in the shallower sleep stages and in REM. So I think people sometimes notice when they sleep in quite a lot, when you have a night when you're trying to catch up from a week of lack of sleep and you end up sleeping 10 hours, you might be more inclined to remember dreams. And that is because you're spending longer towards the end of that period actually dreaming, and you're sleeping more shallowly towards the end of that period, and you're more likely to wake up during a dream and remember it. So we don't remember most of our dreams because we are not waking up during the dream. If you wake up during the dream, like a person who has a nightmare and it wakes them up, you're more likely to remember it. We don't tend to remember the dreams that happen in the middle of the night that we just, smoothly sleep right through. We know that a lot of processing of our memories happens during sleep. One of my favorite, the coolest examples of this is a study where the subjects, the people in the study, were asked to remember a list of words, and the words were something like this: curtain, pane, sill, view, clear, glass, etc. And when you ask these people before they fall asleep for the night, which of these words do you remember? Which words were on the list? Which words were not? They're pretty accurate. Then you have them sleep overnight and you ask them which words were on the list. They will say, oh, window was on the list, even though it wasn't. It was all of these words that have to do with window, that are around the concept of window, but window wasn't on the list. So how we think about that is that the brain is taking information and sort of drawing conclusions from it, as sort of letting go of the details, but keeping the gist or the important bits. So people have a lot of processing of information and coming to conclusions overnight is the thought, or having insights overnight. The guy who invented the periodic table, the story is that it came to him in a dream because he'd been thinking about it quite a lot, and that just kind of gelled overnight.
I
So
think
we
I
know,
heard that. Yeah.
yes, it's
Mhm.
a great story. So the yeah, and the benzene ring, there's the same story, which is the chemical shape of how carbons connect to each other in some molecules. So there's a lot that our brains do that happen during sleep: emotional processing, thought processing, and which parts of sleep, the deeper stages, the lighter stages, the REM, have to do with what kinds of memory and emotion processing is debated. It's not, I think that question is not settled entirely, but some parts of sleep have more to do with forgetting. Some parts of sleep have more to do with forming memories. Some parts of sleep have more or less to do with the emotion processing. So we think that all the parts of sleep are important, and there's a good reason why we have these different stages and why they happen in the order they do. And that's just within the like brain science area. There's also things happening in the body during sleep, which are fascinating. The immune system, the cardiovascular system, lots of things are happening that are very important to the body during sleep. For example, there are studies where people got vaccines, and then they either slept really well the night after the vaccine, or they didn't sleep well the night after the vaccine. And a few weeks later, the people who had slept well the night after the vaccine had much better titers, meaning looking at how well did this vaccine take in their body, how well is it going to work.
Mhm.
The people who slept better, their immune system just did better with the vaccine.
Interesting. Well, isn't sleep basically a time for the body to repair itself?
Yes and no. So there are aspects of repair that are happening all the time, but certain things like the immune system reacting to a vaccine and forming the cells it needs to form, the antibodies it needs to form in order to make that vaccine really work, that is clearly somewhat special to sleep, because for the people that didn't sleep, it didn't happen as well when they were awake. So there's a lot of repair and restoration, but we don't need this level of complexity for repair and restoration. It also doesn't really save us any calories. So that was a theory of sleep a long time ago, is that maybe it was to save energy, but we burn pretty much just as much energy when we're asleep with our brain activity as we do when we're sort of sitting at rest awake. So that isn't turned out to not be a very good explanation.
I think I'd heard somewhere too that sleep allows the brain to clear out some of the plaque and some of the things it needs to get rid of so it can stay healthy. Is that true?
That probably is true. I can't cite any studies on that are coming to mind at the moment, but certainly better sleep has been connected to lots and lots of different diseases, body and brain, both. And it would not surprise me if that were the case. I apologize. I can't confirm that right now.
Hmm. No, that's fine. No, it's such a complicated process. And certainly when you don't get enough sleep or you have sleep deprivation, people experience on the extreme level hallucinations and everything else. I mean, we really
Oh, yeah.
cannot function without enough sleep.
Well, and even more frightening. So if you have hallucinations, you're going to notice and probably think, "Whoa, something's wrong." What's even more scary, though, that's very applicable to drivers, to pilots, to physicians, is this insidious, sneaky way that our brain function really declines a lot when we're sleep deprived, but we don't notice. So, when there was a lot of debate a few years ago, maybe a decade ago at this point, about whether doctors in training should have, 72-hour shifts without sleep, which used to be reasonably normal, or with just naps here and there. There was some research done on where the doctors were given these cognitive tests of processing speed, how well they're thinking and remembering, and their performance went down and down and down as they got more sleep deprived. But they were also asked, when they did these tests, "Do you think you're doing any worse than you did the last time?" And they're like, "Nah, nah, I'm fine. I'm okay." And that is scary, that our ability to function can really go downhill and we don't notice.
Hmm. I remember there was a time I was working on a project. I think I was awake for 3 days straight, and
Yeah.
I was walking around. My coordination was not good. My depth perception was an issue.
Yeah.
It was really weird. It's like, wait a minute, I haven't been drinking. What's going on here? From the lack of sleep.
Well, I think that what's good there is you had the insight, you noticed. I bet when before you noticed, you still had a lot of impairment that wasn't something you were quite seeing yet, and then it
Mhm.
got to the point where you were. And I've had that experience too. I used to pull all-nighters all the time, and I thought that it made the information fresher in my brain because I took the test and I just seen it, an hour ago when I was studying at the all-night diner. Um, that was from a brain science perspective, not a good thing. It was not a good idea. And if I had thought about that differently, I probably would have had an easier time with those tests.
Yeah, because it does. If you don't have enough sleep, I know I need to have probably 7, 8 hours to function the best for me. If I don't have enough sleep, I can plow through the day, but I do think that it takes the edge that I could have away. You seem kind of mentally dull, and I drink coffee to wake up.
Yes.
It takes a while to get that momentum, if you will.
It does. And I think when you have a more regular wake sleep cycle, your body can make those transitions better from sleep to wake, and then from wake to sleep. Because what happens in your body is there are these releases of various hormones, various chemicals that tell us when we should be awake and when we should be asleep. And the coolest example of this is melatonin. So our bodies, our brains, pineal gland will start to release melatonin usually around dinner time. And then the melatonin will increase, and that corresponds with some signal changes in our brains that tell us, okay, we're tired, it's time to go to sleep. The melatonin will increase and peak in the middle of the night, and then it will be way down, pretty well gone by the time we wake up in the morning. And melatonin for us correlates with, causes some signaling that causes us to go to sleep. But in an animal like a cat or a rat that are meant to be awake at night, they have melatonin being released at the same time, and it makes them more awake, not more asleep. So
Really?
melatonin,
Wow.
yeah, yeah. So melatonin is, I think of it as liquid darkness. So it is the signal to our brain that it is dark, and our bodies and our brains should do the things that humans do in the dark. And same for cats, the things that cats do in the dark.
They do like to get the evening crazies. I've got a couple cats, so
Yeah, they're getting that melatonin release and they're like, okay, let's go. Yeah. So when we're sleep deprived, we build up what's called a sleep debt, where if you should be sleeping 8 hours a night and instead you're sleeping 6 hours a night and you do that 3 nights in a row, then you've added up this 6 hour sleep debt. And it's very hard to catch up on that on the weekend, as you can imagine, because there's only so long you can sleep in one stretch, really.
Mhm.
And if you are 12 hours behind by the time you hit the weekend, there just isn't, it just doesn't work. The physiology doesn't work, the time doesn't work. So it's really important to be planning each night to have enough opportunity to sleep. And if your sleep is really disrupted, if your sleeping setting is uncomfortable or waking you up a lot, then it will affect your daytime performance. It will affect your cognition and your mood in ways that you may or may not be consciously aware of.
As well as motor skills, I bet.
Yes, absolutely. Processing speed, motor skills, yes,
Mhm.
indeed.
No.
Reaction time, which I imagine is incredibly important for your listeners,
Oh,
right?
drivers, yes. Reaction time
Absolutely.
is imperative. They have to think on a dime, if you will. They never know what's going to be happening on the road. So,
Right?
all of this is so fascinating. We do need to go to break here. I'm talking with Dr. Rebecca Allen. She's the director of neuropsychiatry at the Seattle Neuropsychiatric Treatment Center. You're listening to the Truckers Network radio show here on TNCRadio.live. Stay tuned for more coming up. TNCRadio.live is proud to carry the Steve Summers Overnight Drive Show. TNCRadio.live is dedicated to commercial drivers. We offer the news, traffic, and weather you need, and the entertainment, sports, talk, music, and celebrity interviews you want to hear 24/7. We have original shows and trucker podcasts that feature some of your favorites, like Ice Road Alex Debogorski and America's Truckin' Sweetheart Marcia Campbell. TNCRadio.live is convenient and designed for professional drivers. The best part is we're free, and you can listen anywhere you are on the road. With just one tap, you can tune into Steve Summers and us right on your phone. Simply download our app by going to app.tncradio.live. That's app.tncradio.live. Welcome back to the Truckers Network radio show on TNCRadio.live. I'm Shelley Johnson, and I'm speaking with Dr. Rebecca M. Allen. She's the director of neuropsychiatry at the Seattle Neuropsychiatric Treatment Center. Dr. Allen, you said you looked up one of the facts of what sleep actually does in the brain in terms of the brain's ability to clean itself.
Yes, yes. So this is what I think is one of the most fun and important things about being a doctor. Yes, we learn tons and tons of information in medical school and undergrad before medical school and residency after medical school. So, but what's most important is being able to look up information and keep up with what's new, and because all of the stuff I learned in medical school, most of it has probably been refined or changed somewhat, or is just blatantly not true anymore. So understanding how studies are done, how science is done, how we know what we know and where to find it and how to look at it critically, is, I think, the most important skill you can have as a doctor or a scientist. So I did not know the answer to the question about the clearing of plaques earlier, so I looked it up. And yes, there is this two-way relationship between sleep and amyloid collecting in the brain. And amyloid is connected with dementia, particularly with Alzheimer's disease.
Mm-hmm.
So when people are awake and have disturbed sleep, they have more amyloid production and decreased amyloid clearance, meaning less of it is being moved out of the brain. And uh, the deposition of amyloid is associated with these sleep problems. So you were absolutely correct on that, Shelley.
Wow. So mom was correct when she said, get your sleep.
Yes, 100%. It's very important, and it isn't just so she can stay up late and watch TV.
I know. As a kid, I always wanted to stay up later. It's like, can I have a drink of water? That kind of thing. And can I make a sandwich?
Yeah, 100%. You don't want to miss anything.
Sure is absolutely. Our drivers, they may not want to talk about it, but they can have sleep disturbances just by the nature of their job.
Yeah.
Some even may suffer from sleep apnea. What happens when people can't sleep the way they should, and what's happening with sleep apnea?
So, sleep apnea is a condition where people are actually partially waking up, usually many times an hour, talking 12, 20, 30 times an hour, very, very briefly. They're not forming a memory of waking up. If you have sleep apnea, you don't, wake up at 7 in the morning and say, "Wow, I woke up 100 times last night." You don't remember. But what's happening is your body is waking you up enough that you can take a breath because you have stopped breathing temporarily. And when you have stopped breathing temporarily, in order to get you breathing again, your body wakes you up and has you change position or pulls you out of sleep stages where your muscles are more relaxed or not moving. So different sleep stages, people are moving more or moving less, and we're moving the least during our complex dreaming for obvious reasons. So, with sleep apnea, the big problem is the massive disturbance in your ability to sort of progress through these different stages of sleep in the order where they're supposed to happen, and just really stay asleep.
Now, when you're snoring, does that necessarily mean you have sleep apnea, or could you just have a sinus issue?
Well, yeah, snoring is not a 100% yes, if you snore, you must have sleep apnea, but it's certainly a sign, especially persistent snoring all the time or a lot of the time. Other things that you can be looking for with sleep apnea is no matter how much you sleep, you still feel tired. With morning headaches are another symptom that people can have with sleep apnea, and high blood pressure. People that have thick necks are also at higher risk of sleep apnea, but that's also it's not everybody who snores and has a thick neck has sleep apnea either. There are actually lots of people who are very thin with very small necks who also have sleep apnea. So it has a lot to do with the shape of the structures that we breathe through in our nose and mouth and neck.
Okay, that makes sense. So, what's the ideal shape? I mean, you don't hear of children having sleep apnea. Is it just what happens in adulthood or?
Well, it does happen in children, not
Oh, okay.
often. So the most common cause of sleep apnea in the United States, at least, though, is weight gain, obesity. And I hate saying that because I feel like doctors are always just criticizing people for their weight and their appearance. And I don't like saying that, but the anatomy here is if you have a heavy neck, if you have a weight pressing on your throat, on that can contribute to the closing of the air passages. And then so you sleep better when you're on your side than when you're on your back.
Hmm.
And what's happening when your your brain wakes you up briefly to breathe is you're switching position to open that back up. The what partners can listen for if you sleep with someone else being able to hear you is if there is a pause in your breathing. And if you have a pause in your breathing at night and then you suddenly gasp, that is very likely to be what we would call an apnea or an apneic episode. So if you're tired, if you have high blood pressure, if you have headaches in the morning, if you snore, if people have heard you gasp for breath, these are all things that would indicate that a sleep study would be a really good idea.
Hmm.
Just to because it's so treatable, and there are so many things in medicine where we can identify the problem, and then our treatments are not good enough. With sleep apnea, our treatments are actually very good. They work really well. Not everybody likes the idea of having something helping them breathe at night. but the devices really actually work. And if the devices don't work, there are these devices that go on your, if the CPAP doesn't work, meaning a device that pushes air through your air passages to keep them open. If that doesn't work, then there are some dental devices that can help keep your passages open. Those don't work quite as well. And then there's also now an implant called a hypoglossal nerve stimulator. And the implant will stimulate a nerve in your neck that will in the sort of the neck and the base of your jaw that will open up your air passages.
And it
So a
only
lot of
does,
treatments.
does it do that only when you sleep?
Yeah, so the device is programmed in order to stimulate when you're sleeping. Yeah,
Interesting. I had not heard about that.
it's not it's not very common
Hmm.
at this point because for most of people, most of the time, the CPAP devices or BiPAP devices, the ones that are sort of pushing air
Hmm.
into your mouth and nose, or mouth or nose, there are many different types of these devices, work really well for most people.
I know a lot of people who say, "Oh, I don't want one of those CPAPs," because they've heard horror stories. Have they improved over the past 10 or 15 years?
They have improved, and I will say there are a lot of them. What I find kind of sad is if a person gets diagnosed with sleep apnea, they try one mask, it isn't very comfortable, and they say, "Well, screw this, I give up. I don't want to do this. I wasn't noticing any problems anyway, except that I was kind of tired." Um, I think that it's important to try at least three different kinds of masks because
Hmm.
there are so many options. There are nose only, there are mouth only, there are nose and mouth combinations of various shapes and sizes. I would encourage you all, when you get a chance, to just Google sleep apnea mask and then, click on the images and you'll see lots of different ones. My favorite one is looks kind of like an astronaut mask. So instead of having something pressed against your nose and mouth, you have a clear sort of shield that presses where the edges of it are pressing against your forehead and the base of your jaw. It's like a clear face shield, and so the air is being sent, onto the whole face and thus into the nose and mouth. And weirdly enough, that tends to work better for people who are claustrophobic. So having something on your whole face that you can see through feels better than having something kind of just against your nose and your mouth.
Yeah, having something over your face. I would be one of those people who'd say, "Get this off me." I mean, I'm kind of a combative sleeper. So that would not stay on my face.
Well, I think that the different kinds of straps and the different kinds of devices, it's important if you have a diagnosis of sleep apnea to just kind of try a few, keeping in mind that having sleep apnea is much more like having high cholesterol than it is like having a headache disorder. So when you have a headache disorder and you try a treatment for the headache disorder, whether the treatment is working or not is entirely up to you and your experience and your report. So if you say your headaches are better, then your headaches are better. Nobody can question that. If you say your headaches aren't better, then your headaches aren't better, period. With high cholesterol, you have no idea. You have to get a blood test and you don't know or feel if your cholesterol is going up or if your cholesterol is going down, but you know cognitively that high cholesterol is a risk factor for lots of bad things happening, a stroke, heart attack. And so will try to take care of it, take a medication, change your diet, that kind of thing. Sleep apnea is closer to being a high cholesterol condition than it is to being a headache condition, because it's not necessarily about feeling better, although most people do. You have sleep apnea and you get a CPAP. If it's working well, you feel more energetic, your mood gets better, your thinking and memory gets better, all of that. But even if you don't get a dramatic improvement, you are still getting protection from a lot of the bad things that can happen from sleep apnea, like increased risk of cardiovascular problems like heart attack and stroke, um, and also depression and memory issues.
Sleep apnea can cause depression then.
Well, impairment in sleep, yes. People who have not slept well are more likely to interpret things negatively and have less positive emotional experience. There's a lot of studies on this in normal people, people who don't have any mental illness, looking at them with sleep deprivation and how they deal with emotional situations or emotional stimuli, and people in comparison to people who've slept well. So the studies on this are pretty solidly conclusive that yeah, our experience of the world, our interpretation of the world, the emotional sort of tinted lens that we look through when we're deciding how important something is and how we're reacting to it, is it's just much more negative when our sleep is impaired.
Makes sense. We do have to go for a brief break here, Dr. Allen. I'm talking with Dr. Rebecca Allen. She's the Director of Neuropsychiatry at the Seattle Neuropsychiatric Treatment Center. You're listening to the Truckers Network radio show here on TNCRadio.live. Stay tuned for more coming up. The Truckers Network helps professional drivers save money and makes their lives easier. We were created for drivers by a commercial driver. We know the industry and driver needs. A Truckers Network membership offers exclusive discounts through our trusted partners on things like truck care, truck parking, tires, oil changes, fuel additives, fitness, roadside assistance, first aid kits, driver training, and a whole lot more. Start saving today. Check us out at app.thetruckersnetwork.net. That's app.thetruckersnetwork.net. Welcome back to the Truckers Network radio show on TNCRadio.live. I'm Shelley Johnson, and I'm talking with Dr. Rebecca Allen. She's the Director of Neuropsychiatry at the Seattle Neuropsychiatric Treatment Center. Dr. Allen, your information has been just fabulous. Where can people get more information?
If you feel like you're struggling with your sleep, like you're feeling tired all the time, you're coming close to falling asleep at the wheel, even though you spent enough hours in bed, you have morning headaches, you have high blood pressure, I would strongly encourage you to talk to your primary care doctor, because they sometimes they can order a simple sleep test that you can do at home overnight. Sometimes they'll send you to a sleep specialist where you can do a sleep test in a sleep lab. Or sometimes you have sleep problems that are definitely not sleep apnea, in which case, talking about some other options would be good to just discuss with your primary care doctor. For mental health issues, otherwise, for feeling depressed, isolated, sad a lot, feeling guilty, down, feeling like life is not worth living, low energy, those symptoms of depression, also good to start by talking to your primary care doctor, because
Mm-hmm.
very often they can start you on one of these sort of first line treatments, and
Mm-hmm.
that works for a lot of people. I tend to see the people where it hasn't worked, but
Sure.
lots of people respond to the first or second medication that they try,
This
and
is
they
good.
can yes.
This is good information. I'm sorry I have to cut you off. We
Oh,
are
it's
going to the
okay.
network news. Thank you so much, Dr. Allen, for being on the show. Your information has been tremendous, and hopefully some people will reach out for more information. You've been listening to the Truckers Network radio show here on TNCRadio.live. Stay tuned for more great entertainment and information coming up right here. Thank you for listening to another great interview on TNCRadio.live and the Truckers Network radio show. All of the material you hear on TNCRadio.live, on our website, our broadcasts, or our podcasts are copyrighted. There can be no distribution without the express consent of TNCRadio.live and its partners. For inquiries, write us at info@tncradio.live. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast of the Truckers Network radio show.